Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling a case, a really difficult one, that just gripped the UK for weeks back in early 2023. It captured everyone's attention and, frankly, sparked this huge, often quite troubling public involvement. We're focusing on the disappearance and, tragically, the death of Nicola Bulley.
Yeah, this case, it goes well beyond just a missing person story. It's become this sort of crucial modern case study, hasn't it? You see how a very local tragedy in, the quiet village of St. Michael's on Wyre in Lancashire just spiraled. It became this national, almost international spectacle. And in doing so, it really exposed some deep fault lines, in police communication, media ethics, and just the sheer destructive power of unchecked public speculation, especially when it's amplified by, digital platforms.
Right. So our mission today, really, is to try and cut through all that noise. There were weeks of it, endless theories, just this huge amount of guesswork surrounding the whole tragedy. We want to move past the ambiguity of the search itself and get to the certainty of the findings. We're going to distill the absolute timeline, minute by minute where we can. We need to understand the police investigation's logic, which was specific, and let's face it, quite controversial.
Very controversial.
Then examine the really severe systemic critiques that came afterwards. And finally arrive at those definitive conclusions from the formal inquest and the independent reviews that followed.
And we've got a pretty extensive stack of sources here. Everything from, the really precise data points from her mobile phone right up to the high-level government responses about how the police conducted themselves. For you listening, this is about understanding not just what happened, but why the reaction to it all became so uniquely, toxic. How did this private loss turn into such a public battleground?
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we need to start right at the very beginning, understanding the precise mechanics of how she vanished. So, Nicola Bulley. She was 45, a mortgage advisor, mother of two, lived in Inskip, but was often in St. Michael's on Wyre, dropping her kids at school. And the events of that Friday morning, January 27th, 2023, they're so clearly marked out by her digital footprint, aren't they?
Yeah.
Which just makes the suddenness of her disappearance even more stark. Can you tell us a bit about the background factors the police were working with right from the start?
Yeah, before we dive right into that timeline, it's probably important to just frame this a bit. The sources do confirm that Nicola Bulley had certain vulnerabilities that were known to the authorities. She was getting treatment for perimenopause, and this was later connected to a known, though private, issue she had related to alcohol.
Okay.
Now, this context, which as we'll see became absolutely central to the police classifying her as high risk, it's sort of this quiet backdrop to what otherwise seemed like a completely routine morning.
Right. So a very normal, structured start to the day, which is exactly why the abrupt halt to all her activity is just so striking. What does the strict timeline tell us about those last known movements?
Well, the timeline is incredibly tight. Around 8:40 in the morning GMT, she did the school run, finished that. Then she took her dog, Willow, a Springer Spaniel, for a walk along the River Wyre. This was, a route she knew well, seemed quite relaxed, and the dog was off its lead. Everything pointed towards comfort, routine.
And this is where her digital activity becomes so vital, giving us these fixed points in time, like breadcrumbs almost, leading right up to the riverbank.
Exactly right. At 8:53, she's clearly professionally active. She sends an email to her employer. Then, just 4 minutes later, 8:57, she's planning ahead, sends a text to a friend, arranging a play date for their children.
So she's engaged, functioning normally.
Completely. And then, at 9:01, she joins a work call, a Microsoft Teams video conference. Now, we know she was just listening in, her camera and mic were off, but that active connection confirms she was still there, still moving, still capable of interacting with her phone at least.
Okay, so actively participating in her life, planning things, listening to a work call, and the last actual physical sighting happens soon after that.
Yes, around 9:10 a.m., that's the last time a witness definitively saw her walking in a field right by the river. The dog, Willow, was still with her, still off the lead. That's the final human confirmation we have of where she was.
Now, that 9.10 mark is so important because the very next data point we have isn't a sighting. It's purely locational, based on her phone.
That's correct. At 9:20, the phone's location data suggests the device itself is stationary, and it's believed to be right in the immediate vicinity of a particular bench by the riverside. So the investigation places her, or at least her phone, at this one specific spot. And this spot, this bench, it basically becomes the absolute epicenter of the whole search effort.
And there's a really crucial technical detail about that Teams call itself. Isn't there something that narrowed the window of her disappearance even further?
Yes, it's a small detail, but it becomes incredibly significant. The Microsoft Teams platform, the one she was connected to, it has this automatic feature. The call just terminates itself if it detects 10 minutes of inactivity or silence.
Oh, okay.
The call she was on ended at 9:30 a.m. So this means the phone must have remained connected and active on that bench for at least 10 minutes after she or the phone got there. But crucially, the system logged inactivity. That's a really chilling marker in the timeline.
And the scene itself was discovered just minutes after that call automatically dropped.
Yes, remarkably quickly. At 9:33 a.m., just 3 minutes after the team's call technically ended, a passerby came across the scene. The phone was found sitting on the bench, still connected to the work network, and the dog, Willow, was found nearby.
Let's pause on the dog for a second. The sources really emphasize that Willow was found alone, but crucially, wasn't distressed, showed no signs of having been in the river. Why did that detail immediately sort of break the simple logic of an accidental fall for so many people?
Well, that detail is absolutely central to why the family and later the public really struggled with the police's early hypothesis. I mean, think about it. If someone falls suddenly, accidentally, into a fast-moving river, especially if they're interacting with their pet, the animal's typical response is usually immediate distress, frantic barking, maybe even trying to follow them in.
Right, makes sense.
Finding Willow alone, off the lead, but apparently quite calm and, importantly, dry near the bench. It just suggested a disappearance that was sudden, maybe quiet, perhaps almost instantaneous. And that led a lot of people, initially at least, to discount the river as the main site of the tragedy.
So that 15-minute window from the last sighting at 9:7 to the estimated time of entering the water around 9:22, it just became this complete vacuum, didn't it? And because the physical evidence was so minimal, it was just ripe for every possible theory to float.
Exactly. And this minimal but intensely ambiguous scene, it demanded an immediate response from Lancashire Constabulary. Their very first defining action was to classify Nicola Bulley as high risk. And that initial assessment really dictated the entire direction and, crucially, the scale of the investigation that followed.
Okay, for listeners who might not be familiar with UK police procedures, what exactly does classifying someone as high risk mean in practice? Why is that distinction so important operationally?
Right, so high risk is basically the highest grading a missing person case can get. Operationally, what it means is the police have to throw significant resources at it straight away. It gets priority over almost everything else, and they often deploy specialist units immediately. It shifts the whole thing from just a general inquiry into a full-blown emergency mobilization. But, and this is key, it also means the police need to have a strong, demonstrable reason for escalating it that high.
And their justification was those specific vulnerabilities we touched on earlier. Can you explain a bit more how the police used that private information to justify classifying her as high risk right away?
Yeah, they use it essentially to build their initial working hypothesis. The police justified the high-risk rating by pointing to Nicola's documented struggles with alcohol, which they specifically linked to difficulties she was having related to the menopause. And critically, the sources confirmed that police and health professionals had actually been called to the family home just 2 weeks before, on January 10th, following what they called a concern for welfare report.
Oh, okay, so there was prior contact.
Exactly, and that prior event gave them the sort of institutional knowledge they felt they needed to conclude that she faced a higher risk of accidental harm than, say, a typical missing person might.
So the police were operating with this confidential background information, suggesting an inherent vulnerability. And that allowed them, at least internally, to pretty much dismiss the likelihood of anything suspicious or criminal happening very early on, which led directly to their very firm working hypothesis.
Precisely. Very, very early in the investigation, Lancashire Constabulary went public, stating their working hypothesis was an accidental fall into the River Wyre. They stressed repeatedly that there was absolutely no evidence of suspicious activity, no foul play, no third-party involvement. This became the force's unwavering official line, and it was designed, really, to narrow the search focus exclusively onto the river and its immediate environment.
But this immediate, very firm stance, it clashed instantly and quite emotionally with the family's perspective, didn't it? And that contrast created the first really major crack in public trust.
Oh, it was a huge psychological disconnect. Nicola's family, her partner, they just found the accidental fall theory completely unconvincing. They expressed intense skepticism, saying it just wasn't supported by the evidence they saw at the scene, namely, the calm dog, the phone placed carefully on the bench. Her partner, Paul Ansell, was very vocal publicly, saying he was 100% convinced she hadn't gone into the river.
Wow. That creates this fascinating tension, doesn't it? You've got the police relying on structured data, prior vulnerability assessments, professional experience perhaps, and then you've got the family relying on gut instinct, deep personal knowledge of Nicola. How did the police try to manage that early contradiction?
Well, they essentially managed it by doubling down on their scientific confidence, if you like. Police superintendents kept reiterating publicly that the river fall remained the single working hypothesis, and they were, quote, as sure as they can be that she hadn't left the immediate area of St. Michael's on Wyre. Initial search efforts, like tracing every possible witness, remember the woman in the red coat, the woman pushing a pram.
Yes, I remember those appeals.
They were quickly identified and ruled out, which only confirmed the police's belief that all the evidence pointed inwards towards the river, not outwards towards some broader kind of disappearance.
But the paradox just deepened, didn't it? Because despite this absolute confidence, there are really extensive early searches of the river itself, the river banks, tracing the wire all the way out towards the sea. They yielded absolutely nothing physical. And that dead end just amplified the skepticism from the family and very quickly from the public, too.
That initial dead end, that was the critical failure point, really, for their communication strategy. The public saw this high confidence from the police, but absolutely no physical results, juxtaposed with this desperate disbelief coming from the family. And that mismatch, that gap, it created the perfect breeding ground for alternative theories to just flourish, no matter how certain the police were internally.
As you said, those initial searches found nothing, yet the police stuck to their hypothesis. This failure then triggered this immediate escalation in resources, didn't it? Turning the search into a massive institutional effort. What exactly did they deploy?
Oh, the search quickly became a sort of textbook example of a multi-agency mobilization. You had dedicated police divers in the water, specialist sniffer dogs working the banks, aerial drones giving them high-resolution pictures, plus overhead surveillance from police helicopters. And then externally, they brought in His Majesty's Coast Guard, mountain rescue teams, even local fire and rescue crews. It was a huge, sustained, and pretty exhaustive operation, focused entirely on the water and those really complex riverbanks of the Wyre.
There was also that specific piece of tech she was wearing that everyone pinned their hopes on initially, thinking it would give the final answer straight away, but it ended up being useless, right?
Yeah, that was the Fitbit. She was wearing a pretty sophisticated activity tracker, and in a perfect world, that device could have given them precise location data, maybe even heart rate readings showing a sudden shock, or movement patterns right up to the last second. But the investigation found its last data sync had actually happened before she disappeared that morning. So without a recent sync, the account was basically technologically useless to the police. It just eliminated another potential key investigative avenue and forced them back to relying on the phone data and, hydrological modeling. It was another small frustration that just compounded the mystery.
And all that frustration, that information vacuum, eventually led to an external player getting involved. Someone who, maybe well-intentioned, ended up adding a huge amount of confusion to the public story. Peter Falding and his company, Specialist Group International.
Ah, yes, Falding. His involvement was a massive turning point in how the public saw the search. His team brought in this highly specialized gear, particularly side-scan sonar, which is specifically designed to find submerged objects or bodies in murky water conditions like the Wyre. And Falding himself, he was a very vocal public figure, wasn't he? His commentary immediately got immense media attention. He publicly called the disappearance strange, highly unusual, saying he'd, quote, never seen something so unusual in his entire career.
Right, and his public statements seemed almost immediately to contradict the official police line, didn't they? Just by introducing that idea of strangeness, it cast doubt on their competence.
That was precisely the damage. You had Falding, an external expert, appearing very confident using this high-tech equipment, and then after his team did this extensive search of the specific stretch of river where the police detectives believed she must have gone in, Falding's team finished up and announced publicly they couldn't find her there. He stated quite unequivocally that the search area was, quote, completely negative.
Wow, so you had the police saying, we're sure she went in here, with total confidence. But then a respected private expert, using supposedly superior underwater tech, says, nope, she's not where you think she is. That must have created a massive credibility crisis for the police.
Oh, absolutely. And Faulding even went further. He expressed his personal belief that it was pretty unlikely she'd been swept far out to sea, arguing the distance was just too great for a body to travel that far in that river environment without being found much quicker. So this public conflict, the expert versus the police, it created the perfect storm for public skepticism. It led people to think, well, either the police are hiding something or they're just fundamentally incompetent.
Right.
Because the failure of two major high-tech searches of that primary location, well, for many in the public, the only logical alternative left was foul play.
And this forced the official police search to dramatically change direction, didn't it? Even though the police internally still seemed to believe their original hypothesis.
Yeah. By February 9th, because of the pressure, because of the failed initial sweep, the official search had to shift its geographical focus. They moved downstream from the local St. Michael's area, right down towards the mouth of the River Wyre, out into Morecambe Bay. They were following hydrological models suggesting the body might have traveled further than they first thought. But this shift, to many observers, just looked like a confirmation that the police had been wrong about the initial location all along.
And Faulding's high-profile involvement, it didn't come without professional consequences for him either, did it?
No, it didn't. His conduct, especially that public commentary, which contradicted and, you could argue, actively undermined the official police work, it led to him being formally removed from the National Crime Agency's Expert Advisors database, pending a review. It really highlights that institutional tension, doesn't it? Between external expertise, however well-meaning, and the hierarchical structure of a major police investigation. His attempts to help ultimately just complicated the facts and really damaged the investigation's standing with the public. So after weeks of this intense searching, all the public drama, the institutional conflict, the facts were finally and tragically established. It was February 19th, nearly 3 full weeks after Nicola Bulley vanished.
3 weeks. 3 weeks of national focus, ending with such a grim discovery. Tell us about the recovery itself.
The recovery happened when 2 members of the public, just walkers, discovered Nicola's body in the River Wyre. Now, this was about a mile, maybe 1.6 kilometers, downstream from that central search area near the bench in St. Michael's on Wyre. And crucially, the body was found right next to a fallen tree, tangled up among reeds and really dense undergrowth.
Okay, so the location, while it wasn't right by the bench where Faulding had focused his search, it still fundamentally confirmed the police hypothesis that she had entered the water back in the village.
Exactly. It validated their core theory, even though it also demonstrated just how incredibly difficult searching that complex river environment actually was. Being tracked by a fallen tree and hidden by that thick undergrowth, well, that explains why even the extensive high-tech searches on the surface failed to find her initially. It also explains why the police, despite all the scrutiny, remained so confident internally that she was somewhere in that river environment.
But the recovery scene itself, even in that moment, which should have brought some closure, it highlighted just how unhealthy the level of public obsession and sensationalism had become.
Oh, the invasiveness was deeply disturbing. The sources specifically note that immediately after the body was found, the scene was just overrun by members of the public trying to get photographs of the police operation, of the recovery site itself. People were climbing over fences, trying to get past the police cordon, and astonishingly, some were even pretending to be journalists, just to get closer to what was obviously a deeply sensitive scene.
That's unbelievable. It speaks to a complete breakdown of basic ethical boundaries among some people.
Absolutely. It was chaotic and profoundly disrespectful, a real intrusion into a family's tragedy. One man was actually arrested later and bailed on several charges, including malicious communications and perverting the course of justice, specifically related to him recording video from inside the police cordon. It just underscores how public engagement had shifted from, concerned searching early on into something far more invasive and, in some cases, actually criminal.
And the recovery then led pretty quickly to the formal processes, identification, and the inquest.
Yes, on February 20th, the body was formally identified as Nicola Bulley using dental records. The formal inquest followed quite swiftly, concluding in June 2023. And this is the point, really, where the facts stopped being hypotheses and speculation and became hard legal conclusions.
What were the definitive data points and findings that the inquest finally put on the record?
Well, the inquest confirmed that timeline using precise data analysis. They looked at the mobile phone data, the Fitbit data, and suggested she entered the water at 9:22 a.m. Now, that places the point of entry very, very close to that bench where her phone was found just minutes later. And most importantly, the final finding from the coroner was absolutely definitive. The cause of death was accidental drowning.
The coroner's report tackled those months of speculation head-on, didn't it?
It did, very directly. The inquest concluded there was absolutely zero evidence that she had been harmed, assaulted, or influenced by any third party before she entered the water. The clothing recovered with her, including her boots and a harness, it was all consistent with an accidental fall and subsequent drowning. So, therefore, that initial heavily criticized working hypothesis from Lancashire Constabulary accidental fall and drowning was ultimately proven correct by the scientific and forensic evidence presented at the inquest.
So the actual mystery of the disappearance was solved, but the huge institutional and social damage caused by the search itself, that remained.
Yes, and this is really the analytical core of our deep dive today. The Establia facts ultimately confirmed the police's basic theory was right, yet the process of getting to that conclusion was just widely condemned. The aftermath generated these really intense critiques against three distinct groups: the police themselves, the traditional media, and then the public, particularly amplified by social media. This critique is such a vital lesson in modern crisis management, isn't it?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's break down those failure mechanisms, starting with what was probably the police's most controversial single decision.
Yeah.
That public disclosure of Nicola Bulley's private health struggles.
The decision to publicly release details about her struggles with alcohol and the menopause, that was the absolute flashpoint for the political and social firestorm that followed. Now, the police intended for this disclosure to justify why they'd classed her as high risk and explain their unwavering certainty that the case wasn't suspicious. They hoped it would, stem the relentless flow of conspiracy theories.
But the strategy just backfired spectacularly, didn't it? It created a whole new PR crisis for them.
Oh, it became a huge scandal. It prompted intervention right from the top. The Home Secretary at the time, Suella Braverman, formally demanded an explanation and justification from the force. Concerns were voiced publicly by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer. Even senior women politicians started weighing in, which really broadened the critique beyond just operational failure into these quite serious allegations of systemic sexism.
Penny Mordaunt, who was leader of the House of Commons then, she was particularly outspoken, wasn't she?
She was. She called the health revelations shocking, disturbing. And the former Victims Commissioner, Vera Baird, she really articulated the core dilemma of that disclosure perfectly. She said, look, if these private details were genuinely crucial to help find her, they should have been released immediately, on day one.
Right. Makes sense.
But if they weren't necessary for the search itself, then releasing them later looked like nothing more than an attempt to manage the narrative by focusing on the victim's perceived instability. Baird argued pretty forcefully that this later release carried sexist overtones, suggesting, that a vulnerable woman was somehow inherently prone to accidental death, almost blaming her for it.
That shift of focus from the investigation's potential failings onto the victim's character. That's a really powerful critique, isn't it?
Absolutely. Zoe Williams, writing in The Guardian, argued very strongly that the level of detail released was completely unnecessary. She suggested it, quote, appeared to be introduced purely to discredit her as a rational actor. Effectively, it shifted scrutiny away from the police's failure to find her quickly and onto the perceived personal failings of the missing person herself. And that generated this really damaging perception of victim blaming, which just severely undermined the already fragile public trust in the police handling of the case.
So the police were trying to shut down speculation, but the method they chose just ended up fueling a completely different and arguably deeper controversy about privacy, ethics, and gender.
That's the tragic irony of it. And beyond that specific disclosure, the overall communication strategy of Lancashire Constabulary was just widely condemned. One source famously called it a car crash communication strategy. Their failure to maintain a consistent, transparent, proactive briefing schedule. It created the very information vacuum they were supposedly trying to fill. This sort of passive communication, combined with the family's very public skepticism, actively ensured that rumor and speculation would just dominate the whole narrative space. And if the police kind of created that vacuum, then the traditional media driven, let's be honest, by competition and the inherently sensational nature of the case, they just rushed in to exploit it, often seeming to ignore fundamental journalistic ethics in the process.
The family's public statement condemning the press. That was one of the most powerful moments in the aftermath, wasn't it? What specific actions led to that really strong outburst?
Yeah, after the body was found, Nicola Bulley's family publicly condemned both Sky News and ITV News by name, saying their conduct was shameful. Now, this condemnation came directly from those outlets repeatedly and persistently contacting the immediate family directly, even after clear, explicit requests for privacy during what was obviously their period of highest distress. It really demonstrated this competitive rush for exclusive content that just seemed to utterly disregard basic human dignity.
Baroness Wheatcroft's description of this behavior, feeding frenzy, it really resonates with that critique.
It does. She called it a feeding frenzy, and that perfectly highlights how the pursuit of sensational content just seemed to override basic professional standards for some. And this behavior was serious enough that it attracted the attention of Ofcom, the broadcasting regulator. They expressed extreme concern over the family's complaints and formally wrote to both ITV and Sky News demanding explanations for their invasive contact methods. That's a pretty significant institutional rebuke for established news organizations.
And we also saw elements of the media getting distracted by, frankly, trivial, even misogynistic non-issues, didn't we? Which just underscored the degradation of the reporting quality in some quarters.
Yeah, this was arguably the absolute low point. When Detective Superintendent Rebecca Smith held that press conference to try and address the rampant theories, the same conference where she controversially revealed the health details, two columnists from the Daily Mail focused their commentary afterwards not on the complexities of the search or the investigation's difficulties, but on criticizing the detective superintendent for wearing a sleeveless dress.
That is just astonishing. Trivializing the incredibly difficult work of a senior officer leading a major investigation purely based on her clothing choice.
Zoe Williams, again, rightly identified this incident as a low point for traditional media. It just showed how quick certain segments of the press were to replace any kind of substantive analysis with trivial, often quite personal attacks, further blurring that line between actual reporting and just creating spectacle. The competitive nature of the coverage seemed to ensure the focus stayed firmly on the drama, not on the factual, painstaking, and ultimately tragic process of the search. Which brings us neatly to the final and perhaps most contemporary area of failure, that explosion of speculation and actual physical intrusion that was facilitated and amplified by social media, particularly those sites known for short-form, often completely unverified video content.
Detective Superintendent Smith was very specific in her criticism of this phenomenon, wasn't she? What did she say about this whole private detective issue?
She was unequivocal. Smith directly criticized social media users, specifically naming platforms like TikTok, who had physically traveled to the search area in St. Michael's on Wyre and were, in her words, playing private detectives. She stated very clearly that the resulting torrent of false information, rampant speculation, and harmful rumor they generated was actively detrimental to the professional police investigation and, crucially, caused immense additional distress to Nicola Bulley's family.
And this wasn't just online chatter, was it? It actually led to genuine physical disruption at what was a highly sensitive scene.
That's absolutely crucial to understand. The intensity of the intrusion by these amateur sleuths was so high that the police were actually forced to implement a formal dispersal order in the village of St. Michael's on Wyre. These video makers were physically causing a nuisance, they were trespassing on private property, and they were actively disrupting the professional search teams. They weren't just armchair critics commenting online. They were physically inserting themselves into an active emergency operation.
That behavior suggests a really disturbing lack of empathy, doesn't it? Prioritizing clicks, views, engagement over the obvious distress of the family and the needs of the investigation.
Yeah, the commentary reflecting on this was quite pointed. Zoe Williams criticized the, quote, glee and shamelessness of people broadcasting their vigilante investigations. She noted, quite perceptively I think, that the initial lack of police transparency created this information vacuum into which armchair detectives and keyboard warriors piled with conspiracies, speculation, and fantasy. The police ended up spending valuable time and resources having to debunk completely wild theories like, remember the suggestions about bodies being hidden in specific local landmarks, empty buildings?
Yes, I do. Utterly bizarre theories.
Totally bizarre. And the police were forced to address them rather than focusing purely on the methodical search guided by the data they had.
And the level of spectacle just reached shocking levels, even involving arrests.
It really went to extremes. We know of at least one YouTuber who was arrested on a public order charge because of his activities near the scene. And incredibly, he then broadcast the incident of his own arrest and the subsequent fine he received, essentially using the chaos and tragedy of the police investigation as a source of content for his channel. This case really demonstrated that for some online users, the tragedy itself became a tool, a way to generate clicks and personal promotion, actively getting in the way of the police's ability to conduct their work with the sensitivity and efficiency required.
Okay, so given these intense, multi-layered failures across policing, the media, public conduct, it seems absolutely inevitable that formal institutional reviews would follow once the inquest had concluded. Multiple investigations were launched, weren't they, to really understand what went wrong, both operationally and ethically?
Yes, exactly. The focus shifted almost immediately from what happened to Nicola Bulley to how the police actually handled the entire situation. And we saw two major independent bodies get involved quite quickly to assess police conduct, which really signals just how severe the perceived failings were.
Right. Can you just clarify for the listener the roles of those two key institutional bodies? It's important we understand the kind of scrutiny involved in these reviews.
Certainly. So first, you had the Independent Office for Police Conduct, usually known as the IOPC. Now, they are the external police watchdog, responsible for overseeing the conduct of police forces across England and Wales. Their specific remit was to investigate the police's contact with Nicola Bulley earlier in January, specifically that concern for welfare call we mentioned. Their job is strictly about looking for misconduct or wrongdoing by officers.
Okay, the IOPC?
Yeah.
And the second body?
That was the College of Policing. Now, they're the professional body responsible for setting standards for policing right across England and Wales. They focus on things like best practice, training, operational effectiveness. The Lancashire Police and Crime Commissioner actually requested a review by them to examine the force's overall handling of the investigation and the search protocols they used. This was much more about institutional learning, identifying systemic weaknesses, and finding ways to improve things for the future.
And the IOPC, they concluded their review relatively quickly, didn't they?
They did, yes. The IOPC finished its review in May 2023. They found no misconduct or wrongdoing specifically regarding that January 10th welfare check. However, importantly, they did identify two specific areas where the police's procedures could be improved. So while the police hadn't technically broken any rules, their handling of that welfare contact wasn't perfect and needed some refinement.
Right. But it was the College of Policing review, the much broader analysis, that delivered the really critical and comprehensive findings later in the year, in November 2023. This is where the force's overall strategy was truly picked apart.
Yes, this independent review delivered findings that basically confirmed much of the public and political critique that had been swirling around for months. It found that, despite the eventual factual correctness of their core theory about the drowning, the police had made significant errors in judgment and strategy along the way.
What were the most damning conclusions regarding that police judgment?
Well, first and foremost, the report reiterated the criticism of the force for publicly revealing Nicola's private health details. It formally confirmed that this controversial decision was indeed an error in judgment. Secondly, the review found that senior police staff had displayed poor judgment regarding transparency throughout the investigation. And critically, it found they failed to adequately support the lower-ranked officers and the investigators on the ground who were managing this immense, almost suffocating pressure generated by the intense national focus.
So a breakdown in communication flow, really both upwards within the force and outwards to the public. And the consequences of failing to control that narrative, those were formally addressed in the review, too.
Yes, absolutely. The review explicitly concluded that the police's failure to adequately and proactively brief the media led directly to what it called the explosion of speculation that characterized those weeks of the search. This formally confirmed the analysis that the police, by failing to control the information flow, effectively ceded the entire narrative to the conspiracy theorists and the more sensationalist parts of the media.
The report also had a specific finding about the involvement of Peter Faulding, the private search expert, which is interesting given how much public trust he seemed to command initially.
Yeah, the review stated quite clearly that the high-profile, very public involvement of that private search team, Faulding's group, actually undermined the police's professional work and actively damaged public trust in the official investigation. So even though the police hypothesis was ultimately proven right, the perception that an external expert had to be called in and then his subsequent contradictory public statements, all of that was deemed detrimental to the investigation's integrity.
It's so clear this case is going to be studied for years, isn't it?
Yeah.
As just a prime example of institutional failure when faced with intense digital scrutiny. And we even see the sort of lingering impact of that social media sideshow in subsequent media coverage.
Absolutely. That 2024 BBC One documentary, The Search for Nicola Bulley, which was a serious, well-produced program with exclusive access, it still drew criticism from some viewers. Why? Because they felt the documentary spent too much time discussing the involvement of those amateur social media sleuths. This persistent focus just confirms that the disruptive role played by those self-appointed detectives is now completely intertwined with the case's overall legacy. It's almost as memorable as the facts of her death itself.
It really does seem the circus became as famous as the tragedy.
And that, I think, ultimately is the core lesson for future investigations in this.
We began this deep dive, really seeking clarity. And what we've established is a tragic truth, one confirmed by data, by science. Nicola Bulley suffered an accidental drowning, precisely as the police initially suspected very early on. The facts were settled definitively by the inquest. And yet, those 3 weeks between her disappearance and her recovery were dominated entirely by unchecked theories, by profound institutional missteps, and by a national spectacle that felt at times completely out of control.
Yeah, this case is just such a crucial study. It really demonstrates how rapidly a professional investigation can lose control of its own narrative when an information vacuum is allowed to open up.
Yeah.
And when you combine that vacuum with this unchecked digital fervor, this online frenzy, and then add an unquestionable judgment from police leadership and certain media outlets, well, a family's intensely private, localized tragedy is instantly transformed into this damaging national carnival of speculation.
So for you listening, you now possess the full timeline, you have the definitive conclusion from the inquest, and hopefully a balanced, detailed view of the really profound controversies that surrounded the process of the investigation itself.
Mm-hmm. And if we try and connect this to the bigger picture, I mean, that independent review clearly criticized the failures in transparency, the errors in senior leadership judgment, the flawed media briefing protocols. It really raises an important question for the future, doesn't it? What concrete operational safeguards do police forces worldwide need to implement now to prevent community speculation, especially in this age of instant, unfiltered digital broadcasting from actively damaging the integrity of an investigation?
That's a huge question.
It is. And further to that, what formal responsibility should the digital platforms themselves bear when their user base turns a critical search operation into a spectacle that actively impedes the work of professionals and causes such immense additional distress to the victims' families? The responsibility for managing investigations in this digital age, it seems it's now shared, and finding the right answers, well, that's far from simple.